Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod, and this is the Monday Night Review. Second time lucky, I'm hoping, because I got halfway through this quite long episode and realised that my microphone was half in, half out. So I gave up, took the kids swimming. I'm back at it. It's a beautiful evening. I'm going to freak myself out because this is quite a long story and it's going to get dark. And I'm sitting in my conservatory. So today I decided to take us back on the London Tube. And again, I'm using my artistic license because this technically should be for Southgate. But today we're going to go to Arnos Grove. Both are in the borough of Enfield in North London. And partly I couldn't wait to get to this story. It's one that I've found really intriguing for quite some time. And partly I couldn't wait until we got to all the way to Southgate, but also partly if you're looking for murders and stuff in Arnos Grove, you do get some, but they're stabbings. They're not particularly nice. They're kind of modern London-y tales, and I wanted to have something a little bit different. So today we're going to be talking about the Enfield Poltergeist. My sources for this episode are Interview with a Poltergeist, which is a Channel 4 documentary from 2007. This House is Haunted by Guy Lyon Playfair, The Reunion on BBC, Wikipedia page. There's a video that's made up of quite a lot of the footage taken called the Enfield Poltergeist, which you can find on YouTube, which I really recommend doing. So, 1977, Peggy Hodgson is a single mother living at 284 Green Street in Enfield, North London. She lives with Margaret, who's 12, Janet, who's 11, Johnny, who is 10 and away at boarding school for problem kids, which we'll talk about a little later on, and Billy, who's 7. They live in a 1920s council house in a large estate of houses grouped in pairs with alleyways in between, with small gardens in the front. It's worth noting from the get-go that everyone really likes Peggy, the mother. When she does the radio interview, she's described as the natural. She's tough, she's kind, she's making ends meet. Nobody's quite sure how, because she gets measly maintenance from her ex-husband, and she has all of this stuff that we're about to talk about and 4 kids to support. She's described as having clear blue eyes and a warm smile. Now, her brother John and his wife Sylvie and their daughter live down the road, 6 doors down. So he features quite a lot in this story as well. It's her home. They've lived there for about 12 years. She's been divorced for about 2 years. Her husband, by all accounts, is a bit of an arse. And one child comes in and out of the story. Johnny comes in and out of the story because he is away at this boarding school for problem kids. So on the 29th of August 1977, Peggy Hodgson goes upstairs to tell 2 of her children to settle down. I believe at the time that it's Janet and Billy that she's telling off, but I'm not entirely sure. It could be Margaret and Janet. She tells them to settle down. Janet complains that the beds are wobbling. She tells the kids to stop mucking about and to go to sleep, and she switches off the light. The next night, she hears a strange noise coming from upstairs, and she goes upstairs to read the riot act to the kids. She tells them to be quiet, and they say they can hear this strange shuffling noise. So Peggy stops to listen, and she can hear it too. Then they hear 4 loud knocks on the wall between them and their neighbours, the Nottinghams. And then a heavy chest of drawers next to the door of the bedroom slides along the floor towards Peggy. She pushes it back the 18 or so inches that it has moved, but it slides out again across the door as if it's trying to block the exit. She tries to move it back, but it pushes against her as if someone is pushing from the other side. This is very strange, clearly. So they go downstairs in their dressing gowns and pyjamas, and they hear more knocking coming from different walls. So they think they're going to go down the road to Peggy's brother John's house, but they're concerned because it's late. They believe he'll already be asleep. But Margaret, the oldest daughter, says, I can see a light on next door at the Nottinghams. They're still up. Let's go there. So Vic Nottingham is described as a burly builder. So they go next door and he says he's going to go to the Hodgson's house to have a look. And he takes his son Gary with him. And as soon as they get into the house, they can hear this knocking. Strange knocking on different walls and ceilings that seems to follow them around the house. Now, Vic is a building and a roofer, and he's used to certain sounds that the houses make. So he's actually one of the best people that could have gone in there. He checks the pipes, he checks all the rooms, the loft, the garden. He cannot find anything. His son says that the knocking seemed to follow them around, and when he had knocking coming from one wall, he put his hand on the wall and he could feel the knocks vibrating through the wall. Both of them were frightened. Both of them returned home. They didn't know what to suggest, and the Hodgsons didn't have a telephone. So Peggy Nottingham, very confusing in this story. There's lots of Peggys, there's lots of Morrises. So Peggy Hodgson is the mother of the 4 children who lives in 284. Her neighbour is Peggy Nottingham. And Peggy Nottingham does have a phone in her house, and she calls the police. Now, PC Carolyn Heaps is in a patrol car with a male colleague, and they are closest to the street. So they get told there's a disturbance in progress at 284 Green Street, and they make their way there. Now, when they arrive, they find 7 people in the small front room of the house looking really scared. Many of them are in their pyjamas, and they get told this bizarre story about a moving chest of drawers and all this knocking. So the police are obviously sceptical, but Vic Nottingham is quite firm, and he says they're going to switch the lights off and all stand still and listen for the knocking. And the knocking starts. So there's 4 loud knocks on one wall and then 4 loud knocks on another wall. The street lamp is shining in through the window, so they can see that no one's moving about or no one's left the room. So the male police officer goes off to do what Vic and Gary have done, check all the rooms, check the plumbing, have a look at the pipes. And PC Carolyn Heaps is standing in the sitting room with the family, and she sees a chair move 4 feet across the floor. Now, this isn't any old wooden dining chair. This is a heavy armchair. And she then went over to the chair. She looked for wires. She lifted up all the cushions. And she would later sign an affidavit swearing to what she'd seen. She even says in a later interview that she found a marble and she put a marble on the floor where the chair had been to see if the marble was going to roll the way the chair slid in case for some reason it had shifted with the house or something. She said the marble didn't roll anywhere. She had absolutely no explanation for the chair moving. Now, eventually the police would say that there's nothing they can do. There's no evidence there of anyone breaking the law. And Vic says the police were clearly keen to get out of the building. He says they were as scared as I was. But understandably, they'd done everything they could. There's no explanation for what's going on. That night, the Hodgson family all sleep downstairs in the living room. They don't get very much sleep at all. And they hope that in the morning, everything will return to normal. But it didn't. The next morning, they're going about their day. Peggy is cooking breakfast, and suddenly Lego and marbles start flying through the air, but not as if they're being thrown. It's so fast, it's like they're being shot from a catapult. Now, Vic and Peggy Nottingham come back round. They should get a shout out for being incredible neighbours. It shows a real community spirit because they get affected by what's going on as well. They come back round and they see 2 marbles whiz past their noses, basically, and hit the bathroom wall. Peggy Nottingham goes over to pick up the marbles just to see that they really are marbles, and she says that when she touched them, they were really hot. So they don't know where else to turn. The police can't help. Vic's looked all over the house. There seems to be no explanation for this, and the Lego and the marbles keep flying round. Vic gets hit on the elbow with some Lego that actually brings a lump up on his elbow. It flies that fast. So Peggy Nottingham suggests that they contact the press to see if the press have a number for a psychic or for someone they can contact. But what actually happens is one in many of a series of coincidences that surround this case. She contacts the Daily Mirror. Now, the Daily Mirror had been involved with Harry Price and the Borley Rectory tale, and they'd had their fingers burnt. They'd believed everything that Harry Price had said, and when it was shown that he had faked some of the phenomena, it made them look bad, and they had sworn never to cover anything paranormal again. But it so happened that when Peggy had phoned up, she spoke to someone who did not know this. It was someone who was new to the paper and didn't know the rule. And so thought, great, this sounds like a great story, and phones the photographer and journalist that live closest to the Hodgson house. So the Daily Mirror sends out photographer Graham Morris and journalist Douglas Bentz, and they go to the house at once. And they arrive, nothing happens. They stick around, they have a cup of tea, they don't hear anything, they don't see anything. And they're just about to get into Bentz's car to leave when Peggy's brother John comes running out of the house to get them back and says that things have started happening again. From then on, Graham Morris describes the house as chaos. He says there were things flying around the room, Lego bricks and marble, people were screaming. He gets hit on the head with a Lego brick hard enough that it leaves a mark, a bruise for a couple of days, and this is still visible when Guy Lyon Playfair arrives and meets him a week later. So Graham Morris and Douglas Bentz check that there's no way these marbles and Lego bricks can be coming from the 3 children present. And Morris starts taking photos, and what's incredibly frustrating for him is that none of his photos that evening show anything unusual. We're used to having phones and digital cameras. He's obviously using camera equipment from the 70s where it's not automatic. There's time in between photographs. But he does have one photograph that he takes as he's being hit on the head by the Lego, and he's obviously clicked it as the Lego's flying through the air, and he misses getting the Lego, but you can see the people that are standing in the area where the Lego came from, and one of them is Douglas Bentz, who has his hands in his pocket, and the other is Peggy Hodgson, who is standing with her arms crossed. So neither of them can have thrown it. So that in itself is sort of evidence. Peggy Nottingham goes on to describe a time when they're all standing in the kitchen and a puddle of water appears on the floor from nowhere. They then, while they're all having a look, hear the loo flush. The bathroom is off the kitchen, it's not an upstairs bathroom, and they hear the loo flush. Everyone's in the kitchen looking at the puddle on the floor, no one's in the bathroom. Vic also describes an instant when he's sitting on the bed watching Janet sleep. She's obviously scared to sleep. The knocking is continuing, And he says that she becomes really restless, and then a padded metal chair that was in between the two beds was suddenly thrown about 9 foot through the air. And Vic is terrified and he runs out of the room. Some of these photographs, Graham Morris does his piece for the Daily Mirror, and he comes back frequently to the house on his own time to take photographic evidence of what goes on there. So he features quite heavily in this story. Peggy's brother John, who lives on the same road with his wife Sylvia, would often come to the house to support his sister. And he's there one night, he hears a thump from the girls' room upstairs, and he goes up and finds Margaret on the floor. But he can't find Janet. He goes to look under both beds, and as he stands up, he sees her out of the corner of his eye. She's lying across a radio that's on top of a chest of drawers with one leg up against the wall and her head dangling down one side. This is so weird because she's literally on top of an old school radio. John calls for his wife to come and see because it's such an odd situation, and both of them check. Janet is fast asleep. So this carries on. They have a few journalists from the Mirror come, but nobody is helping them. And Peggy Hodgson's getting quite desperate. But one of the journalists recommends they contact the Society for Psychical Research, and he contacts them on behalf of the family. They don't have the phone. And the SPR send Maurice Gross, who is an inventor. He's recently joined the SPR after the death of his daughter, who's also called Janet. Now, Maurice and his wife Betty believe that their daughter tried to contact them after she died. There was a series of events that both of them found very strange coincidences surrounding her death, and Gross took these to the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, and joined and requested that he get sent on the next available case that needed investigating. And this in itself was a breath of fresh air. Lots of people had felt that the SPR had become a sort of place for academics to look at charts and papers, and nobody was really investigating anymore. There were lots of people who would like to talk about things but not really investigate themselves. So the fact that Maurice has just joined, he's been ringing up the secretary of the SPR constantly to ask if there's any cases for him to investigate, and he is the closest person, he's the closest member of the SPR to Enfield. So it's sort of fate that he's the person that gets the call. And he's really keen to investigate, but also he's an inventor by trade. He has a very inquisitive mind. He likes to look around things and see how they work and test things out. So he also, being the father of 2 daughters, he has 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. One of the daughters dies, but his children are slightly older than the Hodgson children, and it does seem that he is the person to be sent to this family. He is great with the girls. He understands preteen girls, and he says that when he arrived, he realised immediately that he was dealing with something real and not a hoax. He describes the family as being in a bad state, and there's an atmosphere of real fear. And so he knew that whatever it was, they were genuinely terrified. And he also realised that they had no idea what a poltergeist was. He had to explain it to them, and throughout this case, Janet would call it a polka dice. She couldn't say it. They just were so surprised when he explained to them what he thought it was. And he rightly said, how could they be making up something that they didn't know what it was? this was the 70s. There's no internet, unless they had gone and read up in a library about poltergeists, which was very easy to check that they hadn't done. And interestingly, Janet, who is a big focus for the attention in this story, is not really interested in ghosts and stuff. There are stories of how people would talk to her about things that they'd experienced, and she would lose interest. It wasn't something that she was particularly into. So Gross is the ideal person to go to the Hodgsons. He calms them down, he supports them, and for the next 18 months, he would essentially be like a social worker for the family. He was at the end of the phone whenever they needed him, and he was there a lot of the time. And he very cleverly, pretty immediately, encouraged Peggy to become an investigator with him, to not be a passive victim that these things were happening to. He said she needed to make notes of any activity that was happening. And he said, from what we know of poltergeist activity, it lasts a few days, a few weeks, at most a few months. And Peggy really took this to heart, and she would write down everything that would happen, and she would always be very clear on whether the children could be involved. So initially, after Morris arrives, nothing happens. But on day 3, he's there with Douglas Bence and Graham Morris. And the 3 men are standing on the landing while the family sleep. Now, upstairs at this house, you've got 3 bedrooms. You've got 2 bedrooms and what they call a box room. And that box room was filled with suitcases and other things. The family used the 2 other rooms. The bathroom is downstairs. So the 3 men are standing in the landing. The family are asleep, and at about 1:30 in the morning they hear a loud crash from Janet's room, and her chair has flipped over and woken her up. It's a padded metal chair. She's upset. They calm her down. She goes back to sleep. It happens again, and this time Graham's able to get a photograph just as the chair rights itself, but Janet remains sleeping this time. So they all check her, all 3 of them, and describe her as being almost unconscious. Now, another weird coincidence of this story is that the day after this happens, Gross goes to an evening lecture at the SPR, and as luck would have it, the lecture is on poltergeists. And Gross is sitting next to a man called Guy Lyon Playfair, who is a journalist and investigator and a member of the SPR for some time. He's an experienced investigator. He's very interested in poltergeists, and he's spoken a few words to Morris, but Morris is very new. But they happen to be sitting next to each other, and Playfair had already thought that Gross was actually a breath of fresh air. He questioned things. He was always the first person to have a question, to want to know what practical things people had done. He wasn't interested in what they'd read about. He wanted to know what people had experienced. So at the end of this lecture, Gross stands up, says what he's doing at 284 at Green Street, and says he needs help. He needs volunteers to help him. And Guy Lyon Playfair is waiting for people to rush to volunteer, and nobody does. He's one of 2 people to volunteer, and the other person lives very far away from Enfiled, so doesn't really get involved. Now, Guy Lyon Playfair is a journalist. He's got a background in paranormal investigation, specialising in poltergeists. And he has just finished, he's handed his manuscript into his publishers the day before. And he said if the lecture had been the day before or the week before, he wouldn't have attended. He literally just went because he'd handed his manuscript in the day before. It so happened that it was on poltergeist, and he sat next to Morris, and he was planning on going on holiday. So he volunteered. He said, I'm going on holiday in a week, but if you need me, let me know. And Morris said, yep, great, I do need you. And then hopped in his car and went back to Enfield. And Playfair didn't really think much of it until a few days later. He randomly switched on the radio and hears Maurice Grosse being interviewed. And he said there was something in Maurice's voice that made him... He said Maurice sounded exhausted, and it brought back his memories of the practical side of working with poltergeist activity and how exhausting it is because you're up all night and you're listening to tape recordings and things during the day and you're not getting enough sleep. And so he phones Maurice and says, would you like me to come to the house? And Maurice says, yep, that's great. And so Playfair decides he's going to go for the day, ends up staying for 14 months. So Playfair arrives at the house on the 12th of September 1977. Now, after the lecture on poltergeist, before Playfair joins him, Grosse returns to the house that evening and pieces of Lego start flying across the room. And again, when you touch them, they were hot. He is standing alone in the kitchen and a T-shirt leapt off the table and flew past him. The door to the bathroom opened and closed by itself 3 or 4 times. And something that Grosse and Playfair both noticed separately was that when the marbles would land, they'd land with a thump and they wouldn't bounce. And both of them tried to reenact this. And every time they threw or dropped a marble, it would bounce, as they do. But they said it was very weird. It was no bouncing. It was just a solid thump on the floor. So 2 weeks after the initial disturbances, the investigators start camping out at the house and are convinced that they're dealing with a poltergeist. At one point, Janet returns home from the park and she finds her bedroom chair balancing on top of her bedroom door, leaning against the wall. And a journalist is there and he accuses her of setting it up herself. She becomes very indignant about this. And they have a look and it's very precariously balanced. When Maurice touches it with one finger, it falls. And Playfair then tries to replicate it and says it took him a long time, much longer than Janet had even been upstairs for. She'd literally gone upstairs, seen the chair and come back downstairs. There's no way she could have done it. Peggy Nottingham goes and looks around the house one day when the police are there. Police, as they said initially, have come back to check in and see what's going on in the house. The kids are at school, so Peggy Nottingham takes them in, and she goes upstairs with the policeman, and she says that one of the beds in the kids' room had an impression on it as though someone was lying on it. There'd been no one in the house for at least 2 hours. After the police go, Peggy goes upstairs. The bed looks normal. She tries to recreate it by lying on the bed herself, but when she stands up, there's no impression there. So it really looked like an invisible person is lying on the bed. So the BBC hear about this haunted house that's happening, and it's a slow news day, so they decide to send Ros Morris, no relation to Graham Morris or any of the other Morrises mentioned in this story. And she goes to the house, and on the first night she's there with Maurice Grosse, and they hear a lot of thumping and knocking. You can hear this on YouTube. And Ros noticed that the knocking always comes from very high up the wall. She said it moved around different walls, but it was always very high up. It was higher than a child's height. They see a bed shaken violently and the bedroom chair moving across the room. And Ros, when later interviewed in the 2007 documentary, she says she hadn't experienced anything like it before or since, and she doesn't really talk about it because she was so freaked out by what happened. There's also a history throughout this of equipment going funny, as often happens in cases of hauntings. So at one point, or later on, when Rosalind comes back to record, she brings a new fancy recording machine that she's used many times. It's the latest technology, and it doesn't work. when they get into the bedroom. And she takes it back to the tech guys at the BBC, and it's metal inside has been twisted in a way that they don't understand how it can have happened. It would need someone who's incredibly strong, and it's obviously just been in Roz's bag the whole time. She hasn't opened it up and gone in there with anything. One night, Graham Morris brought round a whole load of cameras to set up in the house. They had automatic triggers so he could take pictures in the room when he wasn't there, and he's tested them all out beforehand. They are all charged and ready to go, and when they start wanting to take photos, they don't work. They all simultaneously drained of power at the same time, and this would happen numerous times. There are recorders that have all the buttons pressed down and stuck. Something even gets unplugged from the wall at one point. Now, the idea about poltergeists, and I am going to do a separate episode on this, but poltergeists usually happen in an unhappy home, and the Hodgsons was an unhappy home. Their divorce had happened when Janet was 9 or 10, and the father, the ex-husband, used to come to the house every fortnight to hand over the maintenance money. Now, Margaret and Janet didn't like their father. They would try and be out when he came round. I don't think he had been a particularly pleasant person. Some accounts say that he had brought his girlfriend around to the house before the divorce, before the marriage actually broke up. And he would sometimes bring his girlfriend over when he brought the maintenance money round. He didn't come into the house, and Peggy would be civil, but it made her very upset that he'd bring his girlfriend round, and obviously she's there struggling, bringing up the 4 children. The family itself's not very well off. They're struggling to make ends meet. So it's a stressful situation. It's also usual for poltergeist activity to focus on a child, or quite often a pubescent girl. And this case, the focus mainly seemed to be Janet. Margaret was also experiencing things, and she was definitely involved as well, but Janet was the one that the most things happened to. She was seen to levitate, go into trances, and at one point an iron fireplace is wrenched off the wall in her room. Now, the events that take place in this would take hours to cover, so I'm not going to do that, but they usually involved Lego and marbles being thrown around, beds shaking, beds being flipped over, drawers opening, chairs moving, books being thrown from a shelf. One night there was activity going on in Janet's room, and they were all there, and they looked at her mother's bed, which was now in they all slept in together eventually, and there was an indentation on the pillow as if someone's head was lying on the pillow, like Peggy Nottingham had seen with the police. Pools of water appeared on the floor, often with an unusual shape and a designed outline as if drawn by a child's finger. Playfair would try and recreate these shapes, but water that was poured from a glass or a jug or squeezed from a cloth would splash when it hit the floor, whereas these were not, there were no splashes visible. Later on, there would also be writing in excrement on the bathroom, excrement smeared on the bathroom wall and thrown at people from apparently nowhere. There were also a few sightings of apparitions, not just by the family. Vic Nottingham saw an old lady standing in one of the windows of number 284, the Hodgson's house, and he only told his wife about it. But the same day, Peggy Hodgson saw Vic, and she said she'd just seen a woman standing in a different window of her house, and her description exactly matched his. The incident that really convinced Playfair was when he watched Janet get up from an armchair. She was in the living room, he was in the kitchen, he was looking right at her, and she gets up from the armchair, which then slides forward and then falls backwards. He tried to recreate this and he found it very difficult to even move the chair by himself. There was no way an 11-year-old could have done it or done it so seamlessly that the people who were looking at her couldn't have seen how she did it. The chair was simply too wide and too heavy for one person to flip over. By late October, the family are all sleeping in the same room with the light on. Sofas were levitating, furniture was spinning round. The family was thrown out of their beds at night. Luckily, Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair are usually there. Grosse is there all the time, basically. Playfair is in and out, and they always have recording equipment. And one thing that Maurice Grosse is very good at is if you listen to the recordings, sometimes you'll hear a thump and some screaming, but then Maurice Grosse will always say, Janet has been thrown out of her bed with her mattress on top of her. So he's very good at documenting everything that's going on. One night, just after Playfair leaves, he describes what he hears on the tape as what sounds like someone drilling from a wall. And in fact, the iron fireplace in the bedroom starts moving, and the part of the fireplace flies across the room and lands on Billy's pillow, just missing his head. Now, the fireplace, Maurice takes it immediately home, and he says it was heavy for him to lift, so it wouldn't have been possible for one of the children to throw it with such force across the room. The bottom part of the fireplace is pulled out, but it's kept into the wall by a pipe. So they were shocked that it could have been wrenched off the wall by such power. And this gives Grosse and Playfair the idea that perhaps, as with all poltergeist activity, is thought to resonate from a stressed young person. They thought they would send Janet to see a physicist at the University of London to see if she could bend metal, much like Uri Geller, who was big at the time. And it was determined that she could bend a spoon with her hand 6 inches above it. During their investigation, Playfair and Grosse get psychiatrists in. Now, Peggy Hodgson is very suspicious of the local NHS psychiatrist, who had been the person who had deemed her son Johnny unstable and had sent him to this boarding school for problem children. Grosse and Playfair have said that they met Johnny on numerous occasions and could see absolutely no evidence of him being at all problematic or difficult in any way. If anything, Janet is always described as being sort of extroverted and over the top and loud, and the person who gets mentioned, whereas Johnny, they couldn't see any reason for him to have been sent away to this school. And Peggy, understandably, is very anti the psychiatrist because of this. They also have mediums brought in, which occasionally do help, but not for long. And the whole family is exhausted. So Playfair and Grosse send the family to Clacton-on-Sea for the week. They're at breaking point. Everyone's exhausted. The activity goes on until 3 a.m. Janet and Margaret are constantly being thrown out of their beds. They're missing school because they're so tired. And while they're away, nothing really happens in the house. There's a bit of knocking, and there's some knocking for the family who are away. But nothing really happens, and they have a lovely, relaxing break. But when the family return, it's almost like it gets worse. Janet begins producing, she does a series of drawings that she does, her mother describes her as being in a sort of trance, and she does 9 drawings, and they are of people with blood coming out of them. They're really disturbing. And Peggy is there, and as the drawings are finished, she takes them away, and Janet starts on the next one. And Janet actually never sees these drawings. Interestingly, one in particular was of a woman with blood coming out of her neck, and underneath, Janet prints a surname. And when this is checked out, the surname matches that of the family who had lived there before them. The mother of the house, the woman of the house, had died of a tumour in her throat. Other behaviour really starts to give cause for concern with Janet. She goes into trances where she would gain phenomenal strength. At one point, she hits her head into a wall. Gross has to restrain her with Morris, the photographer, quite often. And he becomes really concerned that she's going to hurt herself badly, maybe even kill herself. She's in such violent trances. She has to be physically restrained. On the 26th of November, they get a doctor to come to the house who injects her with 10 milligrams of Valium in an effort to calm her down. They say that she possibly has paranoid schizophrenia. And it does calm her down for about 50 minutes. But then Playfair, Gross and Peggy hear a crash, and they run upstairs to find Janet once again on top of the radio. And she's asleep, she's out of it, but she's kneeling on top of the radio with her head down. For days, she would have these violent fits. And it was just awful for everyone to watch, and it was scary. And any doctors that checked her out declared her normal. Her blood pressure was normal, her heart was normal. They just didn't really know what to do. She would convulse, moan, cry, thrash about on the floor. And when a torch was shone into her eye, her pupils would not contract. She was out of it. It was also at this time that it would seem that Margaret and Janet would have shared dreams. So the family had all been sleeping together, but they moved Janet, because of her violent fits, they moved her into a separate room. And they would be in the landing again, and they would hear them basically having the same dream. And one night, Playfair wakes Margaret up. She's just called out Janet's name, and she starts shouting, "Go away, you 10 little things." And so Playfair wakes her up, and she says, "Why did you wake me up?" And he said, "I think you were having a nightmare." And from the other room, he then hears Janet shout, "Margaret, where are you? Where have you gone?" So they go and look at Janet, and Janet is still fast asleep. So one night when Margaret's sleep talking, she's talking about the 10 little things, the 10 people again. And they ask her, who are these 10 people? And she lists different people from different ages until she gets to number 9. And she says she can't see. Number 9 has no face. And number 10, she suddenly shouts, "Bill Wilkins." And when they say, "Who's Bill Wilkins?" she says, "He's the man who died in the chair downstairs." Now, there are members, they were reporting things back to the SPR, and there were members who just believed everything was hoaxed by the children. Numerous members of the SPR came to the house. They'd stay for 5 or 10 minutes. And they just thought it was Janet and Margaret making everything up. And Gross and Playfair said the kids had definitely played a few tricks, which is what they expect their children. And quite often in poltergeist occurrences, the children involved will try and mimic the events that are happening. He said, but it was so obvious and they would get caught. And Janet later, when interviewed, says they did fake some of the occurrences, but she says they only faked around 2%, and they almost did it to see if they'd be caught out, and she said they were always caught out. It would be things like after the recording instruments started to get moved or disappear, Janet and Margaret hid it once, but when they found it again, they could hear Janet saying to Margaret, "Let's hide the recorder." You know, it was silly things like that where it just wasn't, it was done like it was done by 11-year-old kids. Also, quite often things would happen at night, and as the family were all sleeping all in one room, Peggy, who took it, you know, she knows her kids, and she doesn't. No one is enjoying this. Everyone's exhausted and at the end of their rope, and you can hear her in some recordings saying, "Janet's nowhere near the, you know, if the door slams shut, she'd say no one's near the door." She was very aware of things that could be her kids and could not be her kids. And what's really horrible is by now most of the family are frequently seeing apparitions, faces at windows, shadowy figures on the stairs, something moving in their peripheral visions, footsteps, moans, growls, and sometimes what sounds like human speech in another room. Even the youngest child, Billy, who rarely took any notice of what was going on, he would apparently wrap his head up in his pillow and sleep soundly all night. He was the one that was not losing any sleep. It was a sort of family joke that he would bury his head in his pillow and off he'd go to sleep. But one time he screamed solidly for half an hour, having seen a face staring at him from the wall in his room. And the face he described was exactly the same as one his mother had seen on a couple of occasions. Janet is now being rolled out of bed up to 50 times a night. And I think also it's really interesting to note that as a parent, you know, if your kids are trying to do something and it's 3:00 in the morning, they tire out. They just naturally tire. And, you know, Janet's asleep when she's being kicked out of bed quite often. It's, you know, I think it's quite, I'm not saying, I don't know what to believe, but I think you can't rule out, you know, she fell out of bed with the mattress on top of her 50 times in a night. An 11-year-old girl would get knackered doing that. I think it would be very obvious to her mother if she was doing it. But at one night, she's in bed asleep and her mother is in the room with her, and Janet is pulled out of bed. The door opens and Janet is dragged through the door and dragged down the stairs head first. And her mother, you can hear her mother saying she was nowhere near, that no one was anywhere near the door. I saw it open. So a doctor and a fellow member of the SPR comes to the house and puts Janet under light hypnosis and asks her questions. And they say, who are doing these things? And she says, me and Margaret. And they think, oh, is she admitting to it? And they say, right, well, what's causing it? And she says, I don't know what's making us do it. And they realise that basically she and Margaret are doing the things like falling out of the bed and stuff, but they don't know what's doing it. And they ask her, and she says what it feels like. And she says it feels like cold hands on her body pushing her. Now, the Daily Mirror photographer, Graham Morris, takes some photos of Janet seemingly levitating across her bedroom. These have been widely criticised, and I see why. They look like she could be jumping. What is interesting, though, is if you look in the background of the pictures, so you can see how he's out of the room. He's using a trigger to take the pictures. He can hear the noises in the room, and he's using this remote trigger. And the photos are taken at a quarter-second intervals. So you could say, right, that's her. She's jumping off the bed. But there's two things that are worth noting. Where she lands, and you can see her sisters being apparently pulled out the bed next to her, but also the way her sheets are. Her sheets are at different positions while she's in midair. So that's worth having a look at. So yeah, she jumps from her bed to the bottom of her sister's bed, which is quite far. It's quite a weird trajectory. And the sheets do seem to move while she's in the air. Whether that's real or not is one thing, but Hazel Short, who's a lollipop lady, did see Janet levitating. She saw her lying flat, floating up and down in front of the bedroom window. And Janet, when asked, said she was scared because her head hit the window and she was worried that she was going to fall out. And Hazel said, you know, everyone doubts what I've seen, and I was so sure of what I'd seen that she said she went straight home and lay flat on her bed to try and see if she could make herself levitate in the way that she'd seen Janet, and she couldn't. At one point, Morris and the others had to pull Margaret free from what everyone involved describes as an invisible child, an invisible hand pulling the child's leg. She was halfway down the stairs with one leg sticking backwards, not even holding onto the banister, rooted to the spot. She basically was going downstairs to go to the loo and then shouted, "It's got me and I can't move." So Morris Gross and Peggy take a hand each and try and pull her, and they said it was like she was rigid as a statue. Eventually they twist her to get her sort of out of the grasp, and she moves and it's fine. All the time while this is going on, the knocking continues. Sometimes it would appear to sort of run down the hall and through other rooms. Furniture's regularly being turned over, including the heavy sofa. It would take 2 people to put it right. Janet was flung out of her bed and her mattress every night, and one morning Peggy collapses in exhaustion. She has to spend a few days total bed rest at her brother's, and the council arranged for the children to spend a few days in a home. On the 12th of December, they're all sitting in a living room and they hear a dog bark, and this would be perfectly normal, but there was no dog in the house. And Janet says they heard that noise whilst they were away at Clacton-on-Sea. They heard this dog bark, but they sort of didn't really think anything of it. But Morris Gross realises that if it can bark, then he can try and get it to talk. So he records it speaking, and he asks it questions. He asks it to say his name. And it has this really weird, deep male voice. Now, this voice is hugely controversial. It's clearly coming from Janet. Janet says it feels like it's coming behind her, and she can feel vibrations on her neck. Ros Morris is the BBC journalist, is among many who have tried to recreate this voice, and she said she did the voice for about 5 minutes and her throat then hurt for 2 days. She could barely speak. The voice coming from Janet would go on for hours, and Janet would show no sign of vocal distress. Interestingly, Graham Morris, who's the Daily Mirror photographer, was not convinced by the voice. He's one of the people who just believes that it was put on by Janet. Morris Gross, ever the investigator, even at one point gets Janet to take a mouthful of water, and he puts tape over her mouth, and the voice still comes clearly. And when he untapes her mouth, she spits the water out. The man says that he's loads of different people, one of them being Bill, who is the previous owner who died downstairs. And he says that he's angry that they're in his house. And when asked why he keeps tipping Janice out of the bed, he says, because it's my bed, she's in my bed. Now, Morris Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair say that this is very typical of a poltergeist, because it's energy. It's just using energy. It's not really a ghost, a possession of the guy who died in the chair downstairs. It is just a way of it getting attention. So Morris Gross has got a son who's recently qualified as a solicitor, and he's obviously been at this house for a number of months and going home and telling his family about it. And Richard wants to come over and speak to one of the voices, one called Bill. And so he comes over and he's standing outside the bedroom. And at the time, the voice would only speak when no one was in the room, which again, obviously would raise a whole load of suspicion on Janet. The voice would also swear a lot. So Richard is standing outside on the landing and he wants to see what's happening. So he thinks to himself, I'm going to look through the crack in the door that was ajar. And at that moment, the voice says, "Shut the fucking door." And Richard said he felt like his mind had been read. And he decides he's going to question the voice about what happened when he died. And the voice says he went blind, had a hemorrhage, fell asleep, and died in the chair in the corner of the front room. Richard describes it as undeniably an old man's voice, and he believed it could not have come from an 11-year-old. One morning in January 1978, something out of a scary movie happened. Peggy had some furniture from a house up the road where a little girl had been murdered. And as soon as the poltergeist happening started, she got rid of the furniture. She was superstitious about it and thought maybe it was something to do with that furniture from the murder house, and she'd got rid of it. But she'd also got some sharp knives from the same house, which she'd wrapped in a bag and put in the back of a kitchen drawer. One night, one of the voices emanating from Janet said, "Get rid of the knives. Tommy is dangerous with knives." And Tommy is the name of apparently mischievous spirit that was responsible for throwing the Lego and the marbles. The voice had said it was Tommy. He's a little boy. He does all the naughty things. And Peggy has had enough of his shit, so she just carries on as normal. And the girls are sleeping late. She's up in the morning, the next morning, doing the ironing in the kitchen, and the girls are sleeping late. There'd been goings on until about 3 o'clock the night before, so they weren't going to school, and she was letting them sleep in. And Janet comes running in and says there's a knife following her around. So Peggy goes upstairs to look in the bedroom. She can't see anything, but on her way back downstairs, she finds a wooden-handled serrated knife on the stairs halfway down. The knife was one from the set that was hidden in the back of the drawer in the kitchen. And Janet had described how she'd woken up, she'd started to go downstairs to go to the loo, and found the knife facing her when she got halfway down. And she turned around and gone back upstairs, followed by the knife. So she then turned round and run downstairs to tell her mother. Now, throughout all accounts of this case, there's always this, it's mischievous, it's not malevolent, but that would have scared the living bejesus out of me. And it's around this time that the voice then also starts to come from Margaret. It sounds exactly the same, if it might even be a bit clearer, but it doesn't have any effect on her voice afterwards. So these voices will come from these girls, and then they'll be able to talk in their normal voice afterwards. Whereas all the other adults who have tried to recreate this voice, which is done using your false vocal cords, have really damaged their throats afterwards. Weirdly, a few months later, this is all, there are stories in the press, very detrimental to the family and upsetting. But a few months later, Maurice Grosse is contacted by Terence Wilkins, whose father, Bill, had lived in the house before the Hodgsons moved in. And he listens to the recordings of the voice, and he says it sounds like his father. And the voice describes exactly as his father had died. His father had died of a hemorrhage. His mother had gone out to the shop and come back, and his father was dead in the chair in the corner of the room, and he died of a hemorrhage. Now, in 1978, Peggy, with the help of Grosse and Playfair, has Janet admitted to the Maudsley Hospital for psychiatric testing. She had, as I said before, she was horrified by the local psychiatrist, but this guy was a friend of Playfair's, and she, I think, was so relieved to be getting help because the doctors couldn't work out what was going on. And she gets declared completely normal. They run all sorts of tests. She has a lovely time. She's having a break. Janet, she's in a nice room. She's looked after. And, they find nothing abnormal about her brain or anything. And after she returns, the happenings start to diminish. And this is standard for poltergeist activity. Things start to die down when the stress dies down. So one thing that I think is very noticeable, if you watch Janet being interviewed, she's clearly distressed. A film comes out based on the story of the Enfield Poltergeist, and she is upset that the film is coming out. She doesn't want to talk about it. She got bullied at school to the extent that crane flies were put down the back of her shirt, which just sounds horrendous. Her brother is spat at in the street. They're ostracised. They're living in a residential area of London. Everyone knows everyone else's business. When Janet's having the trances, one night Playfair is down the road in the pub having his dinner, and he can hear her screaming from the other end of the road. Everyone knows what's going on. It's all over the press, and there's no privacy, and they're ostracised by many of their neighbours. Janet says she dreads going home as she never knows who's going to be there. People were coming in and out. The Daily Star ran a picture of Janet on the front page with the headline, "Possessed by the Devil." They're really... People come in and out. Some of the people who come in, and they don't even speak to Peggy. They just turn up, barge into her house, and sort of accuse the children of hoaxing things. And it's very distressing for the family. One thing that's very clear from reading Playfair's book is a lot of the activity is exhaustingly repetitive. It's just night after night of being flipped out of your bed and having knocking waking you up and your kids not sleeping. And it takes a toll on the family. It is not the attention seeking that I think a lot of people think, it's easy to explain the Enfield Poltergeist because of the attention seeking. One thing that does come out is that just before the activity started, Janet and Margaret had played with the Ouija board, and Janet also has no memory of the trances when she goes in. She has no memory of the drawings, and she only knows about the trances when she's shown the photographs of them afterwards, which she finds really distressing. One of the last things to happen is she gets dragged across the room and the curtain gets wrapped around her neck, and she screams, and her mother goes to help her and says, the curtain was really tightly wound around her neck. It was took all her strength to free her daughter. And there are just so many things that are going on. Playfair and Gross keep records of everything. Playfair says, he gets home at 1 or 2 in the morning, sleeps for a couple of hours, and then he's up listening to all the recordings they'd taken the day before, making notes, making sure everything's in chronological order. They have all the results from the psychics they've seen, the doctors they've seen. He's collating all of this all the time. But, they stop counting. When they get to 400 incidents, they stop counting. He thinks there's well over 2,000 by the time it all finishes. There's just a lot going on, and this case has divided everyone. If it was, as many believe, a hoax by the family, it seems like a very odd one because they don't benefit. They're ostracised by the community. Janet is sent to a psychiatric hospital. Peggy had a breakdown. They would have been clever to get it past people who basically were recording everything they were doing. One very early theory was that the Hodgsons, who were council tenants, wanted to move and had come up with this poltergeist as a ruse to get to the top of the list for a new house. Peggy was offered a new house and refused to move. She said, "It's my house. I've lived here for 12 years. I'm not going to move." And in fact, she would live there for the rest of her life. She never accepted money from anyone. She never sold her story. She was struggling financially and could easily have used this to make money, and she didn't. It was not a happy event for the family. Janet left home at 16 and married young. Peggy felt exploited by the press. The younger brother, Billy, would die when he was just 14 of cancer, and Peggy stayed in the house for the rest of her life. And Margaret and Janet would say that when they went to visit her afterwards, there was still a presence there watching over them, she felt. And it was calmer and nothing happened. It had settled down, but there was definitely still something there, which would fit. It would fit with the idea of a poltergeist being a focus of teenage energy. And as Janet and Margaret grew up, it diminished. So Playfair points out in his book, This House is Haunted, a great deal of activity was witnessed in good conditions by at least 30 people, including police, a solicitor, and doctors. So I think I'm always really wary when I talk about anything to do with hauntings, because it's so easy to just pass it off as mass hysteria. In the 2007 documentary, you have one doctor who says, if one person, if you're discussing an event afterwards, it's very easy to become convinced that you've seen something you haven't. And the thing here is, as Playfair says, there were so many people who saw something that couldn't be explained that it's very difficult to pass the whole thing off as a hoax. When Peggy dies in 2007, a new family moved into the house, a mother and her 4 sons, and they don't know about the history of the house. The Maurice Grosse and Guy Playfair are very specific that none of the address and the name of the family are never mentioned in the press, and that stays. That it's very rare for people to actually find out where this takes place. So Claire Bennett is the woman who moved in next, and she says she never saw anything, but she felt a presence in the house, like someone was watching her. And her sons would wake up at night hearing people talking downstairs. One night, one of her sons wakes up to see a man walking into the room, which is something that the Hodgson children would often say they saw. By the end of their time with the poltergeist, they would see a man in brown trousers walking into the house, and Peggy's brother John had gone into the house when they were in Clacton and seen a man wearing trousers and a collarless shirt sitting at the kitchen table. And he said it was absolutely 100% there. And I closed my eyes and counted to 10 and opened them, and he was gone. And so this boy wakes up, sees the man walking into the room, and he runs into his mother's room and says, "We've got to move." And they move out the next day, and they were there for only 2 months. What is also worth noting is that nobody who was involved in the case has changed their account of what happened or what they witnessed, despite being offered a lot of money from the press to do so. Ros Morris, when interviewed, says she still finds it very disturbing. Grosse and Playfair both believe that what was happening was a poltergeist, not the ghost of Bill Wilkins, and that the poltergeist was just using Janet and Margaret's energy in the stressful situation and was just messing about, which apparently is something that they do. And that is the story of the Enfield Poltergeist. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. I was tempted to do it in 2 parts, so let me know. I don't know, waiting a week in between episodes always frustrates me, so I've done this as one longer episode today. But I love to hear from you, so come and find us on TikTok, Instagram and Facebook, where we're at The Monday Night Revue. Please come and check out the Patreon. You can listen to everything ad-free. You get extra content. You get a mini-sode every week. And a huge shout out to our latest Pendle witch, Jenny Scott, who has already sent in a lovely haunted place for me to check out, which I'm really excited about. You can email me at themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.